They said $2 was too much for a girl like her. By morning, they'd realized it wasn't nearly enough. The heat sat heavy over Dry Creek like it had forgotten how to move, pressing dust into every crack of wood and skin, turning breath into something thick and slow as Ethan Cole stepped off his horse with only 2 silver coins left to his name. The last of everything he hadn't already lost to drought, bad luck, and a world that had quietly decided he didn't matter anymore. The town square wasn't busy, not really. Just a loose circle of men leaning on posts and shadows, watching something in the center with the kind of interest that came from boredom more than concern. And when Ethan got closer, he saw her, the girl, standing there with her wrists loosely bound, not struggling, not pleading, her dark eyes steady beneath strands of wind-tangled hair, her frame slight but unmoving like a stone set into the earth. "No one's buying," the man beside her muttered, kicking dust with his boot, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "Won't last a week out there anyway." And a few men chuckled low, the sound dry as the land itself. Ethan didn't laugh. He just stood there, looking at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't understand but can't ignore, because there was something wrong about the way she held herself. Not broken, not desperate, just still, like she was waiting for something no one else could see. $2, the man said, glancing at Ethan with a smirk. "And she's your problem." And for a second, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of leather and sunburned earth, and Ethan felt that quiet pull again, the one that had gotten him into trouble more times than he could count, the one that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't what it looked like. The coins felt heavier than they should as he pulled them from his pocket, the metal warm from his palm, and when they dropped into the man's hand, the sound rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the lazy hum of the town like a struck bell. Laughter followed, louder this time, sharper, a few heads shaking, someone muttering. Coles finally lost what little sense he had left, but Ethan didn't look at them. He stepped forward, cut the rope with a quick motion, and nodded once. Not a command, not quite an invitation, just something in between. She didn't thank him, didn't even hesitate. She simply stepped beside him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, steady, calm, like none of this surprised her. They walked out of town under the weight of those eyes, past broken fences and empty troughs, into land that had forgotten how to give, and for a long while, neither of them spoke, the only sound the soft crunch of boots and hooves over dry ground. When they reached his ranch, if it could still be called that, a leaning structure of sun-bleached wood and stubborn hope, Ethan paused, glancing back at her, half expecting regret to finally settle in. But it didn't come, not yet. She stepped past him without waiting, her gaze sweeping the land, the sky, the distant hills, as if measuring something invisible, and then she stopped, just stood there, in the fading light, listening. "There's nothing here," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than to her, but she didn't answer, didn't even look at him. Her head tilted slightly as the wind brushed past, and for the first time in months, maybe longer, Ethan felt it too. Not hope exactly, but something close, something quiet and dangerous, like the land was holding its breath, and she knew why. The night settled over the ranch without ceremony, just a slow fading of light that left the land looking even more tired than before, and Ethan Cole stood on the porch with his hands resting on the rough railing, watching the girl move through the yard like she had been there before, like she knew where every loose board and broken post would give beneath her weight. She did not ask where to sleep, did not ask for food, and that silence pressed against him harder than any question could have. Because most people, when they had nothing, they asked, they reached, they tried to take whatever they could, but she did none of that. She simply existed in the space as if she belonged to it in a way he never had. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dust, a place that had seen better days, and had not forgotten them. And Ethan set a tin cup on the table, filling it halfway with what little water he had left, the liquid catching the dim light like something more valuable than gold. And when he turned, she was already there, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to ignore, her eyes flicking once to the cup, then back to him. He pushed it toward her without a word, and she hesitated, not out of fear, but as if weighing the meaning behind the gesture. Then she took it, drank. Slowly, carefully, leaving a small amount behind before setting it back exactly where it had been. A detail so precise it made something tighten in his chest. Most people would have emptied it without thinking, but she did not, and that told him more than any explanation could have. Later, when the moon climbed high and the air cooled just enough to make breathing easier, Ethan lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the usual sounds of the ranch, the creak of wood, the distant rustle of dry grass. But something was different, a rhythm out of place, and when he stepped outside, he saw her standing near the edge of the property, her head tilted slightly, her body still as the land itself, listening. The wind moved around her, brushing against her clothes, carrying faint whispers of dust and distance, and she raised her hand, letting the air pass through her fingers like she was reading something written there. "There is nothing out there," Ethan said quietly, his voice low, not wanting to break whatever strange moment had formed. But she did not turn, did not acknowledge the words, and instead she stepped forward, walking past the dry creek bed that had not held water in months, maybe longer, her bare feet finding paths between stones without looking, and something in the way she moved made him follow, not because he understood, but because he did not. They walked in silence for what felt like a mile, maybe less, maybe more, the land stretching out. In every direction, empty, stubborn, unwilling to give, until she stopped, kneeling down near a patch of earth that looked no different than any other, cracked and pale under the moonlight. She pressed her palm flat against the ground, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and then opened them, looking up at him with a calm certainty that made the air feel heavier. "Dig," she said, her voice quiet, steady, the first word he had heard from her since the town, and it did not sound like a request. Ethan hesitated, just for a second, the memory of empty wells and wasted effort flashing through his mind. But something in her gaze held him there, something unshaken, and he turned, grabbed the shovel leaning against the fence, the wood worn smooth from years of use, and drove it into the ground. The first strike was dry, the second the same, but he kept going, each motion slower than the last, the sound of metal against dirt echoing softly in the night, until, after a few feet, the texture changed, subtle at first, then undeniable, the earth giving way just enough to shift the weight of the blade, and when he pulled it up, there was something dark clinging to the edge, something that should not have been there. Moisture. He froze, staring at it, his breath catching, and when he looked back at her, she was already watching him, not surprised, not proud, just certain, like this had never been in doubt. And in that moment, standing over a hole in the ground with damp soil in his hands, Ethan Cole felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of it, quiet and fragile, and far too powerful to ignore. The first light of morning did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly across the land, touching the edges of the broken fence, the silent barn, the patch of freshly turned earth where Ethan had dug through the night, and he stood there with the shovel still in his hands, staring at the damp soil like it might disappear if he looked away. He had seen dry seasons before, had watched wells fail and rivers shrink to nothing but memory, but this was different, because it was not luck, it was not chance. It was her. The girl stood a few feet away, quiet as ever, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun began to rise, and she did not smile, did not celebrate, as if water beneath the ground was not a miracle, but something expected, something that had always been there waiting for someone to listen. Ethan dropped the shovel and knelt, his hands pressing into the cool earth, digging past the loose dirt until his fingers sank into something softer, wetter, and when he pulled them back, there was no doubt left, the ground was holding life again. He let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding, a sound closer to disbelief than relief, and for a moment, he simply sat there, letting the weight of it settle into his bones. "How did you know?" he asked finally, his voice rough from disuse, but she did not answer right away. She stepped closer instead, crouching beside him, her fingers brushing lightly over the soil, not digging, not testing, just feeling, like she was greeting something familiar. "It speaks," she said after a moment, her voice soft but clear, and Ethan frowned slightly, not because he doubted her, but because he did not understand, and before he could ask anything more, she stood again, turning back toward the ranch with that same quiet certainty, leaving him there with more questions than he had started with. The rest of the morning moved differently than any other day he could remember. The air felt lighter, the sounds sharper. Even the cattle seemed to notice the change, gathering closer to the area where the earth had been opened, their movements slower, calmer. And Ethan worked without thinking, reinforcing the hole, shaping it into something that could hold water, something that could last, his hands moving with a kind of urgency that had been missing for months. The girl stayed nearby, but did not interfere. She watched, sometimes walking the perimeter of the land, sometimes standing still with her eyes closed, as if mapping something invisible beneath the surface. By midday, the shallow pool had begun to collect more moisture, not enough to call it a well, not yet, but enough to change everything, enough to keep hope from slipping away completely. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced toward her, trying to read her expression, but she gave nothing away, no pride, no expectation, just that same steady calm that made him feel like he was the one catching up to something she had known all along. "You could have left," he said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "You did not have to stay." And this time, she looked at him, her gaze direct, unwavering, and there was something in her eyes that made the words feel smaller than he intended. "You paid," she said simply, and the way she said it carried more weight than the 2 coins ever had, as if the act itself meant something beyond ownership, beyond transaction, something he had not considered. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, because there was nothing simple about that statement, nothing he could easily argue against. And before the moment could stretch any further, a sound drifted across the distance, faint at first, then clearer, the rhythmic echo of hooves against dry ground. Ethan straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle leaning against the porch, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. And there, far beyond the fence line, a line of movement began to form, dark shapes against the rising heat, too many to count at a glance. Moving with purpose, not scattered, not uncertain. He felt that tightness return to his chest, the fragile sense of hope shifting into something sharper, something edged with caution. And when he glanced back at the girl, expecting concern, expecting fear, he found neither. She was already watching them, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this, too, had been part of the same quiet conversation she had been listening to all along. And for the first time since the coins had left his hand, Ethan Cole understood that whatever he had stepped into, it was only just beginning. The riders did not rush. They did not scatter. They moved as one long line across the horizon, steady and deliberate, the kind of movement that carried purpose without needing to prove it. And Ethan Cole stood near the edge of his property with one hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle, not raising it. Not yet. Just feeling the weight of it like a question he was not ready to answer. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows behind the approaching figures, turning them into silhouettes that shimmered through the heat. And with every passing second, the number became clearer. Not 3, not 10, but dozens, maybe more. Too many for coincidence, too organized for chance. The cattle shifted uneasily behind him, their usual calm broken by something they could sense but not understand, and Ethan took a slow breath, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read what kind of men rode like that, what kind of intention moved with that kind of silence. Beside him, the girl did not move, did not step back, did not even glance at the rifle, her gaze fixed forward, calm, steady, like she had been waiting for this exact moment since the night she arrived. "You know them," Ethan said quietly, not turning his head, and for a moment there was no answer, just the sound of wind brushing through dry grass and the distant rhythm of hooves growing stronger. "Then, they know me," she replied, her voice even, carrying no fear, no urgency, just a simple truth that settled heavier than the sound of the approaching riders. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, planting his boots firmer into the ground, his mind racing through possibilities he did not like. Men did not travel in numbers like that for nothing, not out here, not across land that had already taken so much from those who tried to claim it. The line of riders slowed as they reached the boundary of his land, not crossing immediately, not pushing forward, but stopping just beyond the broken fence as if an invisible line held them back. and for a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, the kind that made every small movement feel louder than it should, and Ethan felt the familiar tension settle into his shoulders, the instinct to prepare, to brace for whatever came next. Then one rider moved forward, just one, breaking from the line with a controlled ease, his horse stepping carefully over the uneven ground, closing the distance without hurry, without hesitation, and as he came closer, the details sharpened, the braided hair streaked with gray, the steady posture, the eyes that did not wander, did not flicker, but stayed fixed ahead. Ethan's grip tightened slightly, not raising the rifle, not yet, but ready, always ready, and he took half a step forward, placing himself just slightly ahead of the girl, not blocking her, not fully, but enough to show that whatever this was, it would come through him first. The rider stopped a few yards away, the horse settling beneath him as if it understood the importance of stillness, and for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, measuring, weighing, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to speak, to ask, to demand, but before any words could form, the rider shifted his gaze, not past Ethan, not around him, but directly to the girl standing just behind, and something in that simple movement changed everything. The tension did not break, it transformed, like a storm that did not strike but lingered, waiting, and slowly, deliberately. The rider slid from his horse, his boots touching the ground with a quiet certainty. Ethan watched closely, every instinct alert, every sense sharpened, but the man did not reach for anything, did not advance with threat. Instead, he took one step forward, then another, until he stood within clear sight of her, and then, without a word, without hesitation, he lowered his head, not in weakness, not in surrender, but in recognition. Behind him, the long line of riders remained still, silent as stone, and Ethan felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood, because whatever he had expected, it was not this, and whatever he had stepped into with those $2 silver had just revealed its true weight. The moment the man lowered his head, the air seemed to still completely, as if even the wind had decided to wait, and Ethan Cole did not move, not forward, not back, his hand still resting near the rifle, but no longer gripping it the same way, because something about what he was seeing did not match anything he had prepared for. The girl stepped past him then, not in a rush, not in defiance, but with a quiet certainty that made his half-step forward feel unnecessary, and she stopped just a few feet from the man who had bowed before her, her posture straight, her gaze calm, meeting his without hesitation. For a long second, neither of them spoke, and Ethan found himself watching the smallest details, the way the man's shoulders remained slightly lowered, the way his hands stayed open at his sides, not reaching, not threatening, just present. And then the girl lifted her chin slightly, a subtle motion that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. The man straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and when he spoke, his voice was low but carried across the space with a weight that did not need volume. Words Ethan could not fully understand but felt all the same, something like acknowledgement, something like respect. She answered him in the same tone, just as steady, her voice blending with the rhythm of the land itself. And though Ethan could not follow the language, he could follow the shift, the way the tension in the line of riders eased almost imperceptibly, the way their stillness became something else, something closer to patience than readiness. The exchange did not last long, just a few sentences back and forth, but when it ended, the man stepped back half a pace and turned slightly, raising one hand just enough for the others to see. And like a single breath shared across dozens of bodies, the line of riders shifted, not forward, not back, but downward, each one lowering their head in the same quiet gesture. Ethan felt something settle deep in his chest then, not fear, not exactly relief, but the realization that whatever place he thought he held in this moment was smaller than he imagined, that this was not about him in the way he had first believed. The girl turned her head slightly, just enough for her eyes to meet his for a brief second, and there was something there he had not seen before, not distance, not indifference, but recognition, as if she was finally placing him within a larger story he had only just stepped into. She said something to the man again, this time shorter, more direct. And he nodded once, a simple motion that seemed to carry agreement without question. Then he stepped aside, clearing a path, not toward the ranch, but toward her. She did not take it immediately. Instead, she walked back to Ethan, closing the distance between them with the same steady pace she had used since the moment he first cut the rope, and she stopped just in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine lines of dust along her skin, the faint marks of a life that had never been easy. "They came for me," she said quietly, the words simple, but the meaning far from it, and Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding once, because that much he understood. "Are you going with them?" he asked, his voice lower now, not demanding, not assuming, just asking. She looked back over her shoulder at the waiting riders, then returned her gaze to him, and for the first time since he had known her, there was a pause, a moment where the answer was not immediate. "I was always meant to," she said finally, and the words landed heavier than he expected, not because of what they said, but because of what they did not, because they left space. Space for something unfinished, something not yet decided. Ethan glanced past her at the line of riders, then back at the small patch of damp earth behind him, the beginning of something that could change everything. And he realized then that whatever choice stood in front of her, it was not just hers alone anymore, not in the way it had been before those $2 silver changed the course of both their lives. The space between them held longer than it should have, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from something deeper, something deciding its shape. And Ethan Cole found himself standing there with nothing to offer except the truth of what little he had, a patch of land barely holding on, a shallow well that might not last, and a choice that was never really his to begin with. The girl did not step away immediately, did not turn toward the riders who still waited without a single restless movement, and that stillness behind her pressed against the moment, reminding him that time was not stopping, only stretching. "You said you were meant to go," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady but low, not trying to hold her, not trying to push her, just placing the words where they belonged, and she nodded once, a small motion, almost too slight to notice if he had not been watching so closely. "I was," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt, just a fact, something that had been decided long before he had ever seen her standing in that town. Ethan glanced past her again, at the man who had bowed, at the line of riders who had followed that single gesture without question, and he understood then that she was not returning to something uncertain, she was returning to something that had always been waiting for her. "Then you should not stay here," he said, the words coming slower than he expected, heavier than they should have been, because saying them felt like closing a door he had only just opened, and for the first time since he had known her. The girl did not answer right away. She turned her head slightly, her eyes moving across the land, the broken fence, the worn barn, the small pool of water that caught the sunlight just enough to prove it was real, and something shifted in her expression, not enough for most people to see, but enough for him, because he had been watching from the start. "This place was dying," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, not uncertain, but thoughtful, as if she was speaking to something beyond him, "and it listened when you did not leave it." And Ethan frowned slightly, not because he disagreed, but because he did not see himself the way she did. He had not stayed out of strength. He had stayed because there had been nowhere else to go. "It is just land," he replied, almost reflexively, and she looked at him then, really looked, the way she had that first day, weighing something he could not measure, and she shook her head once. "Nothing is just anything," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than explanation ever could. Behind her, the man who had spoken earlier shifted slightly, not impatient, not demanding, just present, a reminder that the moment could not stretch forever, and the line of riders remained exactly as they had been, heads lowered, waiting not for her command, but for her decision. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again, because there was something he needed to say, not to stop her, not to change her path, but to make sure the truth did not go unspoken. "I did not buy you," he said, the words firm now, clearer than anything he had said before, and her eyes met his again, steady, listening. "I paid because no one else would," he continued. "But that does not mean you belong here." And the air between them shifted again, quieter this time, less like tension and more like understanding. She studied him for a long second. And then, slowly, she nodded, not in agreement, not exactly, but in acknowledgement, as if something important had just been placed where it needed to be. Then she turned, not fully, not yet, her gaze moving once more to the riders, to the man who had bowed, to the path that had been waiting for her long before Ethan Cole ever stepped into that dusty town with $2 silver in his hand. And for a moment, it seemed like the world itself leaned in, waiting to see which direction she would choose. The wind shifted again, softer this time, brushing past the dry grass and the edges of the broken fence like a quiet reminder that nothing in this land ever truly stood still. And Ethan Cole watched as the girl took one slow step forward, not toward him, not yet toward the riders, but into that space between, where choice lived. Her movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried weight, the kind that settled deep and stayed there. And for a moment, everything else seemed to fade. The line of riders, the heat rising off the ground, even the sound of the cattle behind him, all of it pulling back to make room for what came next. She stopped again, her eyes moving once more across the land, taking in the shallow well, the worn boards of the barn, the quiet persistence of something that had refused to disappear completely. And Ethan felt that same tightness return to his chest, not because he wanted her to stay, but because he understood now that whatever she chose would change, more than just her path. Behind her, the man who had bowed remained still, his presence steady, patient, not urging, not calling, simply waiting, and the riders behind him mirrored that stillness. A line of silent witnesses to a decision that belonged to one person alone. The girl lifted her hand slightly, not high, not dramatic, just enough to catch the light, and for a brief second, Ethan thought she was signaling them. But instead she let her fingers fall slowly, brushing the air as if feeling for something unseen, something only she could understand. Then she turned, fully this time, her gaze settling on the riders, and she took a step toward them, one step, deliberate, measured, and Ethan did not move, did not call out, because he had already said what needed to be said, already placed the truth where it belonged. She took another step, closing the distance, the space between her and the man growing smaller, the path ahead clearer with each movement, and the line of riders did not shift, did not react. They simply watched, their stillness now carrying something heavier, something closer to expectation. But then, just as the distance between her and them reached its narrowest point, she stopped again. The pause was different this time, sharper, more defined, like a line drawn in the dirt that could not be ignored. Ethan felt it before he understood it, that shift in the air, that subtle change that meant the moment was not over, not yet. Slowly, she turned her head back, just enough to look over her shoulder, and her eyes found his again, steady, searching, and in that look there was no confusion, no hesitation, just a quiet question that did not need words. Ethan did not step forward, did not reach out, but he held her gaze, steady as he could, because whatever answer she was looking for, it was not something he could give, not directly. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different, not heavy, not uncertain, but balanced, like something waiting to tip. And then, without warning, she turned away from the riders, not abruptly, not with defiance, but with the same calm certainty she had carried since the beginning, and she walked back toward him, one step, then another, until the distance she had just crossed was undone, and when she reached him, she did not stop at his side. She moved past him, back toward the ranch, toward the shallow well, toward the place that had begun to breathe again. Behind them, the riders remained exactly as they had been, silent, unmoving, but something had changed, something unseen but undeniable, and after a long moment, the man who had bowed lifted his head, his gaze following her path, not with surprise, not with anger, but with understanding. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something he had been holding far too long, and as he turned to follow her, he realized that whatever this moment was meant to decide, it had not ended anything. It had begun something far more complicated than either of them had expected. She walked past him like the decision had already been made long before the moment demanded it, her steps steady, unhurried, and Ethan Cole turned without thinking, following her back toward the shallow well, as if that quiet movement carried more authority than the entire line of riders behind them. The sun had climbed higher now, burning through the last traces of morning cool, casting sharp light across the land. And the small pool of water they had uncovered shimmered faintly, not large, not impressive, but real, undeniable. And the girl stopped beside it, lowering herself to one knee, her fingers brushing the surface lightly, creating ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. Ethan stood a few feet away, watching, the weight of everything settling deeper with each passing second, because the riders had not left, not moved, not even shifted, and their silence now felt different, less like waiting, more like witnessing. "You are not going with them," he said quietly, not as a question this time, but as a realization spoken aloud, and she did not look up immediately, her attention still on the water, as if listening for something beneath it. "Not now," she replied after a moment, her voice calm, measured, and those two words carried more complexity than anything she had said before. Ethan frowned slightly, stepping closer, the dry ground crunching beneath his boots. "They came for you," he said, and she nodded once, acknowledging the truth without needing to repeat it. "And they will leave when you say," he added, glancing back over his shoulder at the still line of riders, and again, she nodded. But this time there was something else in it, something quieter, something that felt like responsibility rather than control. She lifted her hand from the water and let the last drops fall back into the small pool, then stood, turning just enough to face both Ethan and the distant riders, positioning herself between the two worlds as if that had always been her place. "They came because something changed," she said, and Ethan followed her gaze, not to the riders, but to the land itself, to the dry stretches that had begun to soften near the edges, to the faint hint of green that should not have been there yet, and his chest tightened slightly as the meaning settled in. "The water," he said, and she did not answer with words, only a small incline of her head that confirmed it. Behind them, the man who had bowed stepped forward again, not crossing into the ranch, but coming close enough that his presence could no longer be ignored. And this time, when he spoke, he used slower words, careful English shaped by effort, but clear enough to understand. "This place wakes," he said, his voice low, steady. "And when it wakes, it belongs to more than one man." And Ethan felt the truth of that settle heavily, not as a threat, not as a claim, but as a fact that had always been there waiting to be recognized. The girl turned fully toward the man now, her posture straight, her expression unchanged, and she spoke to him again in her own language, the rhythm of it flowing easily, confidently, and the man listened without interruption, his head slightly inclined, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, there was a pause, a moment where even the wind seemed to hold back, and then he nodded once, a gesture that carried acceptance, not of her return, but of her choice. He stepped back again, retreating to his place at the front of the line, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the riders behind him shifted, not turning away, not dispersing, but easing their stance, the rigid stillness softening into something more open, more patient. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough to remind him how tightly he had been holding it. And he looked at her, really looked this time, seeing not just the girl he had brought from town, but the weight she carried, the space she stood in between two worlds that did not often meet without conflict. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly, and she turned her gaze back to the water, to the small beginning that had changed everything, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite relief, but something close to both. "Now," she said softly, "we listen," and as the wind moved across the land again, carrying with it the scent of something new, something growing, Ethan Cole realized that whatever he thought he had bought with $2 had just become something he could never fully own, only learn to understand. The land did not change all at once. It never did. It shifted in small ways first, quiet ways that most people would miss if they were not paying attention. But Ethan Cole had started paying attention the moment she told him to dig, and now he saw it everywhere, in the way the soil near the shallow well held together just a little longer under his boots, in the way the cattle lingered closer instead of drifting toward the horizon, in the faint green threads pushing through cracks that had been lifeless for months. The girl moved through it all without urgency, without pride, her steps slow, deliberate, as if she was following something written beneath the surface, something older than fences and ownership. And Ethan followed her again, not out of habit now, but because he understood that whatever was happening here, she was at the center of it. Behind them, the riders had not left, but they had changed. Their line no longer rigid, their presence no longer pressing. They had dismounted, some standing beside their horses, others kneeling to touch the ground, mirroring the same quiet listening she had shown the night before. And that sight alone told Ethan more than any explanation could have. This was not about taking. It was about something returning. They are not here to claim it, he said under his breath, almost testing the thought as it formed, and she glanced at him briefly, a small acknowledgement. No, she said. They are here because it is waking. And the way she said it made the word feel larger than the land itself, like it carried history, memory, something that stretched far beyond what he could see. Ethan looked out across the property again. But this time he did not see just his failing ranch. He saw something layered beneath it, something that had been there before him and would remain after him. And for the first time, the idea did not feel like loss. It felt like truth. The man with the gray-streaked braids approached once more, slower this time, his steps measured, and when he stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifted between Ethan and the girl, not dividing them, but including them both in something shared. Water does not belong to one man, he said carefully, each word chosen with intention, and land that breathes remembers who listens. And Ethan nodded slightly, not out of agreement alone, but because he could feel it now, the way the ground responded, the way the air carried something new, something alive. The girl stepped closer to the small pool again, kneeling as she had before, but this time she placed both hands into the water, letting it run over her fingers, and the surface trembled gently, reflecting the sky above in broken lines of light. It will not stay if it is taken, she said quietly, not looking up. It stays when it is shared, and the simplicity of it settled deeper than any rule Ethan had ever known, because out here, survival had always been about holding on, about claiming what little you could and defending it. But this was something else entirely. He looked back at the riders, at the way they waited without pushing forward, at the way they had accepted her decision without question, and he understood then that this was not a test of strength, not a measure of control, but a balance, fragile, quiet, and easily broken. Then we share it, he said, the words coming without hesitation now, not because he had no doubts, but because he had already seen what happened when the land was left to die, and he was not willing to return to that. The girl lifted her head, meeting his gaze, and for the first time since she had arrived, there was something unmistakable in her expression, not distance, not caution, but approval, small, subtle, but real. Behind them, the man inclined his head once more, a gesture that mirrored the one from before, but this time it was not only for her, it was for both of them, an acknowledgement of a choice made together. The riders began to move then, not leaving entirely, but spreading out along the edges of the land, some leading their horses to drink, others standing watch, not as guards, but as part of something larger, something that had just begun to take shape. Ethan stood there for a long moment, watching it unfold, feeling the weight of it settle into something steadier, something that did not press down but held firm, and as the wind moved across the land again, carrying the scent of water and something new growing beneath the surface, he realized that whatever this place had been before, it was no longer his alone, and somehow, that made it stronger. By late afternoon, the land no longer felt like it had that morning, not because it had changed completely, but because it had begun to remember something it had been forced to forget, and Ethan Cole moved through it with a different kind of awareness, each step measured, each glance carrying weight, as if he was no longer just walking across his ranch, but across something shared, something older than his claim. The shallow well had deepened slightly, not by much, but enough that the water no longer looked like an accident. It held steady, reflecting the sky with a quiet confidence, and a few of the riders had worked without being asked, reinforcing the edges with stones, shaping it carefully, respectfully, as if they had done this many times before, and Ethan watched them for a moment, noting how none of them spoke loudly, how their movements seemed guided by something unspoken, something understood. The girl stood nearby, not directing, not correcting, simply present, and that presence alone seemed to keep everything aligned. Like a center point, the rest of them naturally moved around. "You have done this before," Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice low but steady, and she glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the land. "Not here," she replied, "but in places like this," and he nodded slowly, because that made sense in a way he could not fully explain. The idea that land could fade and return, that it could be lost and found again, not through force, but through listening. Behind them, the man with the gray-streaked braids walked the boundary of the property, his eyes scanning, not for danger, but for something else, something Ethan was beginning to recognize as understanding. And when he stopped near the broken fence, he knelt briefly, pressing his hand to the ground the same way the girl had, then stood again, satisfied. "It holds," he said simply as he approached, and the girl inclined her head slightly, acknowledging both the words and the meaning behind them. Ethan shifted his weight, glancing between them. "How long will they stay?" he asked, not out of concern, but because the presence of so many people changed everything, and the man considered the question for a moment before answering. "Until the land does not need watching." And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a fixed time, not a set number of days, but something measured by the land itself. Ethan let that settle, the idea that time here would no longer be counted by his own needs alone, and he found that it did not trouble him the way it might have before. The girl moved then, walking toward the far edge of the property where the ground dipped slightly, and Ethan followed, the others giving them space without being told. And when she stopped, she pointed to a patch of earth that looked no different than the rest, dry, cracked, unremarkable. "Here," she said, and Ethan did not question it this time. He simply nodded and turned back toward the tools, because he had learned that her certainty came from somewhere deeper than guesswork. As he worked, driving the shovel into the ground, he felt the rhythm again, the slow, steady pattern that connected effort to result. And it was different now, not desperate, not forced, but guided, as if the land itself was meeting him. Halfway, the sun began to lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the newly tended earth, and the riders continued their quiet tasks, some tending to the animals, others walking the perimeter, all of them moving with the same unspoken coordination. And Ethan realized that this was not an occupation, not a takeover. It was a presence, one that supported rather than consumed. When he struck softer ground again, when the shovel met that same subtle shift beneath the surface, he did not stop in surprise this time. He kept digging, a faint smile touching his expression before he even realized it was there. He glanced up at her, and she was already watching, not surprised, not impressed, just certain. And in that shared look, something settled between them, something unspoken but understood, that whatever this place was becoming, they were both part of it now, not by ownership, but by choice. And as the first stars began to appear faintly in the sky above, Ethan Cole understood that the $2 he had once thought were his last had only been the beginning of something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The night settled slowly, not as an ending but as a continuation, the kind of quiet that carried work within it rather than rest. And Ethan Cole stood near the second shallow while they had uncovered, his hands rough with dirt, his shoulders heavy but steady, watching as the small pools of water caught the fading light like scattered pieces of the sky. The land no longer felt empty. It felt awake, aware, and that awareness pressed gently against everything, shaping the way people moved, the way they spoke, even the way they chose silence. The riders had made no fire, no loud camp. They had spread themselves along the edges of the ranch like a living boundary, not guarding it, but holding it. And their presence did not feel like occupation, it felt like balance. The girl stood a few steps away, her gaze lifted toward the horizon where the last line of sunlight disappeared. And for a moment, she did not move at all, as if marking something invisible, something only she could feel. Ethan stepped closer, not breaking the silence, just joining it. And after a long moment, she spoke, her voice low but clear. It is stronger now. And he nodded, because he could feel it too, not in a way he could explain, but in the way the air carried something fuller, something that did not fade when the light did. It is not just the water, he said quietly, and she glanced at him briefly, acknowledging the thought without interrupting it. It is everything, he continued, his voice slower, more certain than before. The ground, the animals, even. The way the wind moves, and she nodded once. A small confirmation that he was finally seeing what she had seen from the start. Behind them, the man with the gray-streaked braids approached again, his steps as measured as ever, and when he stopped beside them, he did not speak immediately. He looked out across the land first, taking it in as if measuring its breath. It listens, he said finally, and Ethan let out a quiet breath. Because that word again carried more than it seemed. It was not about sound, not about words. It was about attention, about respect, about presence. The girl turned toward the man, and they exchanged a few quiet words in her language, the rhythm soft, steady, and when she finished, he inclined his head slightly, then looked at Ethan, not past him, not around him, but directly at him. You stayed, he said, and the simplicity of it struck deeper than any praise could have, because it was true, not in a heroic sense, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in the quiet, stubborn way that mattered here. Ethan shifted slightly, his gaze dropping for a brief second before returning. I had nowhere else to go, he replied, honest as always, and the man studied him for a moment, then nodded again, not correcting him, not disagreeing, just accepting the truth as it was. That is why it answered, the man said, and for the first time, Ethan did not question the statement, did not try to find a different explanation, because he had seen enough now to understand that not everything needed to be measured in the way he had been taught. The girl stepped forward then, moving closer to the edge of the land where the second well had begun to form, and she knelt. Again, her hands resting lightly on the ground, her eyes closing briefly as if listening once more, and the moment stretched, quiet and full, until she opened them again and looked up, her gaze steady, certain. It will spread, she said, and Ethan felt a slow, steady warmth settle in his chest, not excitement, not relief, but something deeper, something that felt like purpose. He looked out across the ranch, at the riders who had become part of its shape, at the wells that had begun to change its future, and he realized that this was no longer about survival alone. It was about something larger, something shared, something that required more than just holding on. The stars appeared one by one above them, quiet witnesses to a land remembering itself, and as the night deepened, Ethan Cole understood that what had begun with 2 silver coins had become something no amount of money could ever measure, something that would not end when the riders left, because it was no longer just in the ground. It was in the way he chose to stand within it. Morning did not arrive with noise. It arrived with clarity, the kind that settles over a place after something has shifted deep beneath it, and Ethan Cole stepped out onto the porch with a slow breath, the air cooler than it had been in weeks, carrying a faint scent of damp earth that no longer felt like a memory but a promise. The ranch stretched out before him, no longer a patch of stubborn survival, but something in transition, something becoming. And he could see it now in ways he could not before, the faint green lines threading through the soil, the cattle moving with less urgency, the wells holding steady through the night. The riders were still there, but fewer now, their presence thinning not because they were pushed away, but because they were no longer needed in the same way, and those who remained moved quietly, tending to what had begun, not claiming, not directing, simply supporting. The girl stood near the second well, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze lifted toward the horizon where the light spread slowly across the land. And there was something different in her posture now, not a change in strength, but a shift in weight, as if part of what she carried had been set down. Ethan walked toward her, his boots pressing into ground that no longer resisted every step. And when he stopped beside her, neither of them spoke at first, because there was nothing urgent left to say. After a moment, she turned slightly, her eyes meeting his, and there was a quiet understanding there that had not existed when they first stood in that dusty town. They will leave today, she said, her voice calm. Certain, and Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze moving past her to the few remaining riders, to the man with the gray-streaked braids who stood near the boundary, watching not the land now, but them. Because it is strong enough, Ethan said, not as a question, but as a realization, and she inclined her head once, confirming it. The man approached then, his steps steady, and when he stopped in front of them, he did not speak immediately. He looked at the wells, at the land, at the subtle signs of life returning, and then he looked at Ethan. "It remembers," he said, his voice low, measured, and Ethan felt that words settled differently this time, not as something distant, but as something he had become part of. "And it will not forget who listened," the man added, and there was no weight of obligation in it, no warning, just a statement of truth. Ethan nodded, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition, because he understood now that this place would hold more than water. It would hold choices, moments, the quiet decisions that had shaped it. The girl stepped forward slightly, and she and the man exchanged a final few words in her language, softer than before, not about direction, not about decision, but about completion. And when they finished, the man bowed his head once more, not as he had the first time, not in recognition alone, but in farewell. Behind him, the remaining riders began to gather, their movements smooth, unhurried, mounting their horses without urgency, without ceremony, and as they turned toward the open land beyond the ranch, there was no sense of departure, no feeling of loss, only a quiet continuation, as if they were not leaving something behind, but carrying it forward in another form. Ethan watched them go, the line of riders growing smaller against the wide horizon, and when he turned back, the land felt different again, not emptier, but steadier, like it no longer needed to be held together by anything outside itself. The girl remained beside him, not moving to follow, not looking back, her gaze fixed on the wells, on the ground that had begun to breathe again. "You are not going with them," Ethan said quietly, not surprised anymore, just acknowledging what had already become clear, and she shook her head once, her expression calm, certain. "Not yet," she said, and the words carried no conflict, no hesitation, only timing, and Ethan understood then that her place was no longer defined by where she had come from or where she might return, but by where she chose to stand. The wind moved across the land again, softer now, carrying the scent of something growing, something rooted, and as Ethan Cole stood there, watching the sunlight settle over the ranch that had once been on the edge of disappearing, he realized that the story he thought had been decided the moment he paid those $2 silver was still unfolding, still shaping itself, in ways he could not yet see. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded slowly, the way the land itself had begun to heal, one quiet change at a time, and Ethan Cole found himself waking each morning with a different kind of purpose, not driven by fear of loss, but guided by something steadier, something that no longer felt like it could be taken away so easily. The wells held, not just the first one, but the second, and a third shallow pocket that had begun to gather along the lower stretch of the ranch, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that made the land feel whole again. The cattle moved differently now, no longer wandering toward distant hope, but staying close, their movements slower, more certain, and even the wind seemed to carry a softer edge, brushing across the grass that had begun to return in thin, stubborn lines. The girl remained, as she had said she would, not as a guest, not as something owned, but as something present, something woven into the rhythm of the place, and Ethan no longer questioned it, no longer tried to define it in terms he had once relied on, because he understood now that some things did not need to be named to be real. They worked without needing to speak much, their actions aligning in quiet ways, repairing fences, shaping the flow of water, tending to what had begun, and in those shared moments, something grew between them, not loud, not declared, but steady, built on. Trust that had not been forced, only proven. Sometimes she would pause, standing still with her eyes closed, listening as she had that first night, and Ethan would stop as well, not asking what she heard, only respecting that she did, and more often than not, her guidance led them to the next place that needed care, the next shift beneath the surface that had to be understood. One evening, as the sun lowered and cast long gold across the land, Ethan stood near the first well, watching the water, reflect the sky in a way that no longer felt fragile, and he turned to her, the question forming not out of doubt, but out of quiet curiosity. "Will you leave when it is fully strong?" he asked, his voice calm, without urgency, and she looked at him, her expression steady, the same calm that had carried her through every moment since the beginning. "One day," she said, and there was no sadness in it, no distance, only truth. "But not because it needs me less," she added softly, "because it will no longer need to be shown how to listen." And Ethan nodded, the meaning settling deeper than the words themselves, because he understood now that this had never been about dependence, it had been about learning. He looked out across the ranch, at the life that had returned, at the space that no longer felt empty, and he realized that what had changed most was not the land alone, but the way he stood within it, the way he listened, the way he chose to act without taking more than was given. The sun dipped lower, the sky shifting into deeper shades, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain. Ethan glanced down at his hand, at the faint memory of the 2 silver coins he had once held, and a quiet breath left him, almost a laugh, though softer, because he finally understood what had happened, not in a single moment, but across all the small ones that followed. He had not bought a girl, he had not taken something no one else wanted, he had stepped into a choice, one that had asked something of him in return, something greater than money, greater than ownership. He had been given a chance to listen, to stay, to act without claiming, and in doing so, he had found something he had not known he was missing. The wind moved across the land again, carrying the scent of water and growing grass, and Ethan Cole stood there, not as a man who owned the land, but as someone who belonged to it in a quieter way, and beside him, the girl who had once been valued at $2 looked out over the same horizon, not as something rescued, but as someone who had changed the shape of everything without ever needing to raise her voice. And in that shared silence, the story did not end. It simply settled into something lasting, something that would continue long after words were no longer needed.